Hey there fellow creators, Ben here from Cinder Studios, and this week I wanted to dive into a certain buzzword that you often hear a lot when referring to art supplies and art materials. It's the word archival. But what does archival mean? Why does it matter, and why should you care? That and more coming up. So when it comes to art, what exactly does the word archival actually mean? Archival usually refers to the durability, stability, and permanence of different media. A certain material being archival, though, doesn't necessarily mean it's good for making art. It's more, does the material itself deteriorate, or does the use of the material cause the degradation of whatever you happen to be putting that material onto, such as paper, wood, or canvas? The term archival is also something of a relative term, because everything degrades, anything that's physical will degrade, but it's more, does it degrade faster or slower? And if it degrades very, very slowly, it tends to be something that is more archival. So with those factors in mind, why exactly does it matter that some materials are archival while some are not? For some creators, using archival materials is a way to ensure that their work stands the test of time. For these creators, making this conscious effort is a way, again, to make sure your work lasts and is preserved and doesn't just deteriorate in anywhere from like 1 to 3 years minimum. But this isn't to say that something that's quality, something that's professional, is necessarily archival. Archival and professional supplies are not the same thing. Many art materials have the sort of properties of being archival, but in and of themselves, that doesn't necessarily make them better. Many materials actually can't be archival in the sense that if they're going to work the way you want them to, then that would be a bad thing for them to be. Many materials will actually have some limited properties if you try to make them more archival. Certain inks, for example, which might be archival, won't eat away at the paper, but they also might fade over time. Something like oil paint in this instance is actually kind of archival, but also kind of not, in that the oxidation of oil is a detrimental process, and if you don't put oils on the right kind of supports, then now we've got a problem. Similarly to inks, adhesives of all varieties, a lot of times that's when you're looking at sort of that weird disconnect as well. So it's like, you might have a really sticky adhesive, but it might also eat away at your support. But if you use a more archival adhesive, it also might not stick as well. Some artists also have a similar thought to this with things like more notoriously fugitive paint colors and things like that, as like a fluorescent color, which is known to fade very quickly. Some people think, well, I'll put a UV varnish over this, and that varnish that's UV protected will keep the paint from fading. No, it doesn't really work that way. So just because you're using an archival material in one way or the other, doesn't necessarily safeguard all of your work entirely. Now, as I mentioned before, just because something is a high quality product doesn't necessarily mean that it's archival, but a lot of high quality professional and artist grade things are archival just by the fact that that's a certain standard that a company will produce their products with. That said, there are a few notable things that even if it's the highest quality in the world, the need for archivability isn't actually useful or needed. A great example of this would be masking tape. Masking tape is a notoriously non-archival tool. And again, when I talk about archival stuff here, you got to think about it in the terms of art conservation and museums. So very, very long-term stuff. You know, think about the non-artistic use of the word archive, something that can last, that can exist in storage. And one of those things is masking tape. Now, I can guarantee you you've used masking tape at least a few times in your life to the point, let me put a label on this, let me tape this together. And masking tape is really good for like short-term use, like taping the edges of watercolor paper and things like that. You don't really need to worry about that lasting very long. And if you tape something with masking tape and let it sit for a few years, then you might have an issue with the tape itself drying out, crumbling into absolute dust. Similarly, newsprint is a staple for almost every artist in the universe, and it's a very thin, lightweight paper, but it's also extremely non-archival. It's not the point. No one's saving newsprint in a museum. This stuff exists for practice. It's quality in the sense that it's a good paper for that, but it's like you're not going to be doing a completed drawing on newsprint and framing it. Probably not. Many papers will circumvent this by using sort of a cotton rag or 100% cotton papers. Watercolor paper is very much like this, so if you're seeing that use of 100% cotton, that is done so specifically to create a more archival paper that lasts a lot longer. And of course, certain paints and certain paint colors can be classified as a non-archival product. Think fugitive colors. Check out the video up here I did a couple of years ago on what a fugitive color is. Put short and simple though, it is a pigment that is known to fade. So modern use of dye-based fluorescents are in that. Think old colors like alizarin crimson, Van Dyke brown. Traditional gamboge was a very fugitive color. There's a lot of those out there that just flat out aren't made anymore for that very reason. But again, if you think about a painting that was made a long time ago that's utilizing a fugitive color, the color itself will deteriorate and fade and change over time. And certain materials will also degrade the surfaces they're a part of. Now, it's a little less common to see with paint. One that I just thought of, though it wasn't in my video script here, is traditional iron gall ink. It's great ink. The ink itself doesn't really fade, but what it does do is it rusts and eats through the paper. So it's one of those things where it's like, well, that's obviously a non-archival material right there, but it's still nice to have around. And another one that is very much non-archival is something that I think is going to surprise a lot of people, and that is alcohol markers. Most markers in general aren't super archival, but alcohol markers especially are terrible at this. They're really hard to preserve. The variable effects on papers are all over the place because of the alcohol itself that's in them. But the markers themselves also fade quite considerably. So all of those wonderful Copic marker drawings you have, yeah, they're going to fade. So what is an artist to do about all this? Should artists only be looking for archival materials that'll last perfectly preserved under glass in a museum forever? Well, no, that's not really practical. But with all of this in mind, it's important to think about what are the best practices for artists here. First thing to consider is just overall craftsmanship of your work. It's not simply about use the best materials, use the archival materials, use the non-archival materials. Educate yourself. Do what's best for you as a creator. It's important to know what you're buying and know why you're buying it. You know, don't just buy something that's like, oh, it's archival paper, it must be good, I'm just going to get that one. Get what you need to get to create the best art that you can. It might be an archival material, but it also might not be. As I mentioned before, some companies go out of their way to only make materials which are archival, which takes the guesswork out of it for artists. Now, some of this happens to just picking up whatever material you happen to be using, look at it, read all the text on it, the descriptions. Most companies that make archival stuff will label it somewhere on the product. If it's not labeled, you can always check with the manufacturer, you can always check on the manufacturer's website, or at the very least, just call them up, contact their customer support team and be like, hey, is your stuff archival or isn't it, and what can you recommend? The biggest factor when it comes to archival materials for artists, though, is how you store your work. Obviously, there's some issues with how you display your work. Is it in the best conditions? Is it getting direct sunlight, which can be known to fade many colors and many materials? Or is it under more artificial light? Things like that. But the biggest factor always ends up being long-term storage. And this is where the term archival really starts to come into play. One of the biggest factors that plagues a lot of long-term storage is moisture and humidity, which will kill basically everything. Keeping your work in a cool, dry space off of the floor and away from natural light is the best option. Anything with paper, do your best to keep it away from sunlight and in drawers where it can stay flat, level, and again, away from that UV exposure. Also be aware of, again, the notoriously very non-archival materials. Masking tape, newsprint, fugitive paint colors, notably cheap adhesives. Products like this, if used improperly, can go out of their way to damage the crap out of your work. When it comes to things like technical skill and craftsmanship in art, this doesn't necessarily refer to how well you can render a shape or something. It also refers to How well can you educate yourself on certain materials and certain practices? I kind of hope this video has helped with that a little bit today. And once again, if you're new to this idea of should I be paying enough attention to what's archival and what's not, reach out to companies and ask them. They are great, like pretty much any company that sells any kind of art supply you could ever make or buy or use, they will have a customer support team that are like, this is how we suggest using our products. These are the pros and cons. These are the limitations. Go for it and make better art yourself. So put simply, for something to be archival when it comes to art materials, it just simply means this thing is better at lasting the test of time. It probably won't eat away at anything. The paper itself won't deteriorate. The canvas will last a little bit longer. The paints aren't going to destroy themselves in whatever you painted them on. Archival just simply means lasts a little longer, specifically in storage, controlled gallery, and controlled museum environments. So what about you guys? Do you think about archival quality when it comes to producing your art, or is it something that you just don't prioritize and never really thought of? For me, it's actually a lot more about the quality of the material, paint for example, than it is about how long it's going to last. I'll let somebody else, probably a conservator in 50 or 100 years, deal with that problem. For me, I'm just going to make my art. But in just making my art, it's also about educating myself over and over again, learning new things, and finding ways to make better art and make art more effectively. So I guess I do prioritize it a little bit, but I don't think about it as much. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this, learned something, or just like hearing me talk about art supplies, go ahead and hit the like button, get subscribed if you're not already. Check out my socials in the description box below, and this has been from Cinder Studios, reminding you to keep on creating, and I will see you guys next time. The most archival materials? Well, no, not necessarily.